What if the economy is growing, but your life is getting worse? We are living through a paradox. GDP is rising, you know that, markets are recovering, innovation is accelerating, and yet people feel poorer, more insecure, more uncertain about the future. Some people call this a vibe session, but I don't care that. Here's a real question. Is the problem the economy, or is the problem the way we measure the economy? Because we still use GDP after more than a century. And GDP doesn't measure well being, it measures activity, not necessarily good activity. It counts war as a growth, debt as expansion, asset bubbles as success, but it struggles to capture security, resilience, meaning, long term impact. And if we measure the wrong thing, we optimize the wrong system. Today on InnovEU, the EU Project Chronicles, I'm joined by Steve MacFeely. He's the chief statistician, wow, of the EU OECD. And we go deep into a critical issue. What happens when the metrics guiding policy no longer reflect reality? If you are working on research proposals, grant proposals, Horizon Europe proposals, this episode may fundamentally change how you think about impact, measurement, and strategy. So, welcome to episode 14 of season 5 of InnovEU. This episode is brought to you by my book, Transition Science in the Economy. If you want to understand why GDP is no longer enough and how global transitions reshape risk, opportunity, and squeeze the middle class, and if you want to understand how the AWTY index uses 150,000 data points across 180 countries, this is your framework. Search for transition science in the economy on Amazon. So let's get into the conversation. Come back to InnovEU, the EU Project Chronicles. Today's guest is Dr. Steve MacFeely. He's the chief statistician of the OECD and director of the Statistics and Data Directorate. Now, the OECD is an international organization that helps governments with designing better policies through data analysis and cross-country comparisons. Basically, it brings together advanced economies and tries to improve growth, productivity, well-being, public governance. And Steve's work sits very much in the center of this. He sits at the heart of a question that is really more important than people realize. If we measure the world badly, we govern it badly. OECD produces the statistics and data that underpin evidence-based policy advice across a wide range of economic and social challenges. It's just not GDP, a lot more than that. And his recent work and the public interventions have also highlighted something that is becoming increasingly important. Data governance is no longer a technical side issue. It is becoming central to public policy, innovation, and even to the governance of AI itself. Now, these are all issues that are important for researchers, for innovators, and for policymakers. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I promise I will shut up now and I will start asking questions. And my first question, please, Steve, would you tell us a little bit about how and when did you get to this job and where you come from? A little bit about yourself before we dive in.
Sure. Well, hello, everybody. So I'm from Ireland originally. So my first job, I was a foreign exchange trader working for a credit bank, but I've spent most of my career working in official statistics. So I spent over 20 years working in the Irish statistical system. And then in 2014, I moved to Geneva, and there I was the chief statistician of UNCTAD, which is UN Trade and Development. And then during the pandemic, I moved over to the World Health Organization, where I was chief statistician during the pandemic. And then about 18 months ago, I moved to Paris. And since then, I've been here as chief statistician at the OECD.
So I think you're the perfect person to explain this to us, please. Why does measurement matter so much for public policy? And what do most people misunderstand about the role of statistics in our world?
Well, the role of measurement is to, in simple terms, is to inform policy. The idea is to be able to introduce some neutral evidence into a discussion. So policy is complex. It involves trade-offs. It involves tensions. So the idea is not that necessarily that data will drive the decision, but it will inform the decision. So people can interpret the data differently, but at least if we can agree on the facts, then we can have a reasoned debate. And this is the idea that it's really there to drive kind of the deliberative public space, help people understand the state of the situation. They may differ over the conclusions, and that's okay, but at least we agree on where we are. So that's the idea, very simply, is to provide that evidence in an as independent and as an impartial way as possible, but obviously with the best quality that we can deliver.
You just said something that is very much at the center of a large discussion nowadays. You said if we can agree on the facts, and a lot of people, including me, will say that today, no, we don't agree on the facts. There is no consensual based truth. Is there a remedy for that? Do you see we can overcome this?
Oh my God. If I had the remedy for that, I'd be a rich man. Um, I mean, this recent development, this idea of bespoke truth, post fact, whatever you want to call it, this is of huge concern to us because until recently, at least the facts were agreed upon. And then, as I said, the interpretation differed. Now we're in a situation where people are just producing, let's call it evidence in inverted commas,
Mhm.
and this is quite problematic. So, to be an official statistic, I mean, one of the things that's really important for official statistics is not just the number itself, but it's also transparency around the metadata, around the methodology, around the concepts. So it's just not the number, it's the whole origin of where that number comes from. A lot of numbers now are produced, but that trail isn't available. So we don't know where the number came from. In a lot of cases, it would appear questionable, but we don't know. Um, and then, of course, there's just nonsense. I mean, there's stuff that's just blatant falsehoods, mendacity that's been produced. And it's really hard to deal with that because it seems to be accepted, or at least that the person saying it kind of says, well, no, this is my reality, even though it flies in the face of any objective kind of analysis. And yeah, it's very hard to know how to deal with this.
Well, I know it is. Innovation is one of those areas where everyone wants results, but measuring the results is something sometimes messy. What do you see as the biggest challenges in measuring innovation?
I guess again, to come back to that word trade-off, we're trying to like one of our key functions is to try and produce time series so that we can compare over time and then also comparability so that we can compare across space. And they're the two kind of key objectives for us. So how is one country doing vis-a-vis another, and how is any particular country doing versus the past? To do that, we develop concepts, we develop definitions, frameworks, and then of course the world changes and those concepts are out of date or they need to be adopted. So one of the big challenges we face not only measuring innovation, but just having to deal with innovation is the fact that the world is continually changing. And so there's this trade-off between stability in the statistics, but if they're too stable, then they no longer represent reality. But if they change too often, they fail in their key purpose, which is comparisons. So depending on what we're measuring, we have to strike different trade-offs, different balances between the different tensions that we're trying to achieve. So, for example, one huge challenge we have with innovation is what's the appropriate time period to assess whether something has been good or bad. So let me give you a couple of examples. If we go back to ancient times, when the clipper ships were developed to bring tea from China, crops from the Americas to Europe, initially that was seen as super successful. But if you then look at a longer time horizon, you see it also brought disease and blight, which wiped out huge populations. So if you looked at the clipper ship in a short term, you would say fantastic. If you look at it from a longer time horizon, you might say, well, good and bad. And to come to more modern times, if you look at things like CDOs, which are the derivatives produced by the banking sector, initially, I mean, this was fantastic innovation. But then, ultimately it led to the financial crisis in 2009, 2008, 2009. So again, the question of timing is really important. If you look at something in the short term, it can be fantastic. If you look at something with the benefit of a longer time lag, you might realize, well, it wasn't so fantastic that, that it brought costs as well. So that's just one example. Another big example is just context. Innovation in one place can work really, really well, but it doesn't necessarily translate or scale across when you try and extrapolate to a wider region. And this is one of the things we have to be very careful of, or at least policymakers have to be very careful. When they look at statistics or data out of context, it can be very, very dangerous. So it's very important that you understand the context in which those data were produced.
Yeah, I can see your point there, and I think we can apply the same reasoning to, let's say, social media. In the short run, it was an innovation, very, very positive. Nowadays, we can see some costs. Yeah,
Yeah.
I get that. And when we talk about innovation, we often end up talking about productivity and the evolution of productivity. We hear about productivity slowdowns, but then we have the digital transformation and AI, which promises to really increase productivity, sorry. My question is, how confident should we really be in the indicators that we use to describe these changes? Because how do you measure productivity? Are we still only measuring the productivity of work? Should we
No,
measure
so
productivity of time? I don't know.
yeah, I mean, okay, so there's a lot in that question. So productivity is a very difficult thing to measure anyway. Conceptually, it's quite difficult, but it's become, since the 1970s, 1980s, it's become much more difficult. So back at the beginning of the ICT revolution, we had what was called the Solow paradox, which was essentially this economist, Robert Solow, had noted that we see ICT everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And it took a long time for the productivity statistics to really capture um, the impact of the ICT revolution. And that was a combination of two things. One is there actually was quite a long time lag between the kind of introduction of technology and really seeing the benefits. But also as statisticians, we have to accept there was a measurement issue in that we hadn't adapted the measurement tools quickly enough. Now, if we look at artificial intelligence, we're dealing with the same issue again, but on a much more uh, what it's a much bigger issue because now AI is effectively embedded into everything. But one of the challenges we have, it's very much embedded in ICT. So one of the things we're grappling with is what's the risk of double counting or kind of overestimating the productivity gain the other side, we have different measures. So that the classic measure of productivity was labor productivity, which is essentially looking at how much labor contributes to gross value added. When we look at AI now, I mean, on the one hand, it's generating this massive, or has the potential to generate this massive productivity, but at the same time, it has the potential to wipe out labor. So it may very much accelerate labor productivity, but it may do tremendous damage to economies and societies in doing that. So it calls into question, and again, this is a broader point. Chasing one metric or looking at one metric only, I would say generally I would counsel is very unwise, because life is full of trade-offs. And if you're chasing one target and not looking at all the other kind of effects, chances are you may regret the choice of indicator. Now, having said that, we also produce what's called multi-factor productivity, which is a more complex measure which tries to incorporate labor and capital. It's a more difficult calculation, but it does provide a more nuanced view of productivity. But nevertheless, it's a very challenging time for productivity statistics. One of the other big challenges that we're actually working on at the moment is it's an area that's been talked about for decades, but we're really trying to do something now, which is public sector productivity. And that's incredibly difficult for a whole, not just for measurement reasons, but even conceptually, because if you take something like a hospital, you don't want a hospital running at full capacity. Because as we've seen, every time there's a health emergency, then there's no capacity to absorb a crisis. So for a society to function, hospitals have to have kind of unused capacity, but then that flies in the face of the traditional view of productivity. So there's unused capacity. So this is the issue. Public sector is very different to private sector. It's the same with the policing services. If they're flat out at capacity, then they've no capacity to deal with the crisis. So these are some of the issues that we're trying to grapple with and conceptualize what's an appropriate measure of public sector productivity, because in some cases the private sector concepts just don't translate.
That also applies to defense, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, defense probably even more complex, because it's more like defense is more like an insurance policy. It's something you want to have, but you hope you never have to use.
Yeah.
So in a way, you hope it's never actually functioning, because if it is, then productivity is the least of your problems.
Yeah.
You've got a much bigger issue to deal with.
And that brings me to similar issue about the use of one single indicator, and I agree with what you said. But in my work, I often quote Simon Kuznets, who warned in the 30s, I believe 1934, that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a
Yeah.
measure of national income. I'm reading, but nevertheless, for a century now, or almost a century, we have used GDP as the ultimate definition of success. Basically, what governments, what politicians say, we had a great year, GDP grew. Even Putin says that. From the OECD's perspective, how urgent is the transition beyond GDP? Especially when we see that traditional growth is coexisting nowadays, or for some time now, with a really severe crushing of the middle class.
Yeah. So first of all, as a statistician, if you go to the SNA manual, so the System of National Accounts manual, you will see a warning on the first page, which is from the statisticians saying, please do not use GDP as a measure of welfare.
Nobody read that.
Well, they may have read it, but they certainly ignored it. And this has led, I guess, I mean, ever since Kuznets, but in particular since probably the 60s and late 60s, with the beginning of kind of the awareness around kind of environmental degradation, we've seen various measures that could be kind of thrown under the umbrella of beyond GDP. Now, again, as a statistician, I would say GDP is one indicator that's available from the system of national accounts. So for me, the question I have really is first about labeling. The SNA can produce a wealth of indicators. So my first question is how far beyond the SNA do we need to go? Because beyond GDP, for sure, we need to move beyond. But how far beyond the system of national accounts do we need to move? Because I think the system of national accounts, and in particular the new system that was just adopted last year at the United Nations, the SNA 2025, has incorporated a lot of the criticisms that were kind of leveled at GDP. Not all of them. I mean, some of them, you can't expect national accounts to produce everything. But it does address a lot of the issues. That said, I mean, it still focuses largely on economic welfare and not on kind of the more social aspects. So, you can't expect national accounts to do that. So you would have to have other indicators. The big question then, from a communications, from a policy point of view, is do we try and convince policymakers to move towards using a dashboard of indicators, which is what I would recommend. But what we've seen is one of the attractions of GDP, I think, is that it's one number. It goes up, and simplistically, that's good. It goes down, simplistically, that's bad.
It's simple, yeah.
And that's been why I think they've been trying to shove more and more stuff into GDP. And it's why the statisticians have been resisting, saying, look, national accounts can do so much, but eventually you're going to have to look at a suite of indicators, which is the point I was making at the start. If you chase one indicator, I think it's a rather unwise strategy, but unfortunately, we've seen time and time again, it's a strategy that's been adopted by many.
Well, let me bring the conversation to data governance. You have recently argued that data governance is becoming central not only to public policy but also to governing AI. You specifically mentioned AI. What do you mean by that?
So AI as currently functioning is essentially a massive data processing system. It's hoovering up masses of data and then analyzing it. So the point I've been making, when I hear people talking about AI governance, I'm basically saying there's a sequence issue here. What we need to do is first organize the data, because if the data is garbage, then everything that happens afterwards is going to be garbage. It's the old adage of garbage in, garbage out, except now it's just at a quantum level. And we still have a lot of problems with data. We still have very poor metadata in some systems. We have poor classifications. We have a lot of issues with access. And in fact, as we've become a more digitized society, issues around data access are becoming more pronounced. So historically, we thought of the state as being the big data holder, but in fact, more and more, the states have relatively small amounts of data, and it's the private sector, and in particular, a very concentrated group within the private sector that's holding a lot of the data. So there's a lot of issues over access, and there's issues over ownership. There's all sorts of issues, and they really haven't been addressed. So when I hear people talking about AI governance, I actually think it's a bit of a fantasy, and that we need to actually organize the data governance piece first, and then we can move on to talk about AI governance.
I see your point. Let me bring this to our audience, which are very often involved in grant-funded research, and they are constantly asked by the European Commission or whoever is funding to measure and to prove their impact. That's a word the European Commission loves. So, based on your experience and what we've been discussing, what advice would you give these people? How should they measure the success of their projects in a way that really convinces that they are changing the world? Because they're meant to do that. How they prove they have changed the world?
Yeah, I mean, this is extremely difficult.
I know.
I mean, the first issue is the difference between contribution and attribution. Because if you take things like development, where a lot of donors are giving money towards development, it's a crowded space. Lots of people are doing things. So if we make the assumption, which is an assumption, that that is doing something positive, the most you can do is contribute to it because there's lots of other players in the same space. Um, the bigger question is whether all of those different actors are pulling together or pulling against each other. Um, So look, impact is very difficult. I mean, this is a gross generalization, but inputs are generally easy to measure. Outputs, somewhat more difficult, but possible to measure. Outcomes are extremely difficult. There's no simple metric for that. I mean, to really to really produce an outcome, you really need to kind of produce some sort of a model to try and look at all of the different factors that are contributing and try and figure out what's your real contribution to this. It's extremely difficult. The other general point I would say is that not all things are measurable. We live in an age of quantification now where if you don't have metrics, you can't be taken seriously, which I understand, but it's an unfortunate development in that somehow we've kind of blinded ourselves to the judgment, and that now if there isn't a number, then we're not, that's the end of the discussion. There are some things that really, really and truly are okay. We can put a number on them, but it's, it's not an objective thing like a road fatality or that's an event that happened. We can measure it. I mean, things like happiness, contentment, these are super difficult. Or even, I mean, things like environmental accounts, which I'm very involved in, even that, sometimes you wonder, are we really pushing the limits of measurement? I mean, how do you put a dollar value on nature? Like,
Mhm.
we don't even understand nature in all its complexity. So, I think there's what I would say is a lot more humility is needed around the measurement area and a lot more caution around our interpretation of those numbers.
I really like the way you put it because I think you're right. We could be here the whole day discussing this because it's really, really hard, complicated. But you put it in the right way. We need to be more humble about what we are actually able to measure. So, I know your time is limited, so I want to ask you one final question about the future. Looking ahead, are you broadly optimistic or pessimistic about the future of data, statistics, evidence-based policy making, AI-shaped world? Are you optimistic?
I would say generally I'm an optimist, but my optimism is being shaken a bit recently. In fact, I was at a meeting yesterday where the consensus was, just to give you one example, that open data is basically finished as a movement, because of the geopolitical situation. Now countries are withdrawing. They're afraid to share data, in particular geospatial information, because of events in Europe, and possible events elsewhere like Greenland or And that's really kind of depressing to hear. So I kind of feel data really moved into an age of enlightenment, maybe in the 1980s, where statistics really became understood to be a public good, and that it wasn't just for states, it was actually for everybody. Now I kind of feel like a gravitational pull, and you can see in some countries that's pulling back, and the idea that official statistics are a public good is, I think, is actually being challenged, and we're starting to see it being pulled back towards, no, this is an asset of the state, and
Yeah.
it's not actually for general accountability or general public. And that to me is a very regrettable development, should that go ahead. The other thing I would just caution about is our use of words. I see a lot of areas now where I see this term data driven, and it could be interpreted in a number of ways. Myself and a colleague published a short blog on this, and I do think this is a slightly worrying development. For most of my career as statisticians, we talked about evidence-informed policy, and we understood we were producing evidence, but politicians who would be the decision makers would use that evidence in conjunction with other information. But ultimately, they were the decision maker, and we elected them to make those decisions. Data driven, you can look at a rather, you can look at it as a benign expression, but you can also look at it as in a slightly more sinister way, in that the decision maker now, the human decision maker, has been taken out. So now it's an algorithmic process, and that the data are now literally driving the decisions, which is reducing accountability and allowing politicians to kind of say, well, this had nothing to do with me. I mean, the data told us to do it. And we got glimpses of that during the pandemic, where there was clear tensions between the scientific community and the political community. And this, I think, is a very worrying development, because to me, if you take it to its extreme, it's actually very anti-democratic.
I see both your points, and I totally agree. But okay, let's hope we can do something about it before it's too late. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for this interview. And well, I hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
So you heard Steve. Let's translate this into strategy, because this conversation is not academic, it's operational, mostly operational. So there's a measurement trap. Most researchers projects have a serious problem. They optimize for indicators, for KPIs, for measurable outputs, but they ignore whether those indicators actually reflect reality. As Steve said, not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that is measured actually matters. I love that. So impact is not attribution. That's another issue here. This is not the most important thing, but it may be the most important insight. Your project does not create impact alone by itself on a closed room. It contributes to a system. It is part of society. And if you claim full attribution for those impacts, you may look naive in the eyes of evaluators. So the real strategic shift here is to move from single metrics like GDP to systems of indicators. And most proposals are still stuck in the old method. Um, there's also an AI illusion. That's another issue. Everyone is talking about AI governance, but as Steve said, if your data is garbage, your AI is garbage. The famous Jigo effect, garbage in, garbage out. So the real question is, who owns the data? Who controls access? Who defines the structure? So this leads us to a decision question. If you're writing a proposal right now, are you measuring what's easy or what actually matters? Because that decision will define your evaluation score, but also your credibility and your long-term impact. So to end this episode, if you're working on an EU project right now or another grant proposal, this matters. If you are 2-3 weeks from submission, activate the Grant Shield pre-mortem. You'll have a review of the proposal in 2 or 3 days based on real evaluation criteria. That's not theory. It's how serious teams de-risk before submission. And if you want the full framework behind this thinking, grab Transition Science in the Economy on Amazon. Please like, subscribe, share this episode with your consortium partners. And remember, if we measure the wrong thing, we will build the wrong future. See you in the next episode. Bye.